Alright, ladies and gentlemen, so like I told you in class, today what we're going to do is we're going to focus our screencast on writing and kind of the beginning of writing. So I'm going to try and take you guys through the process step by step. So we're going to break it down very small, and today's focus is really just going to be the different kinds of questions that you can get on an APUS history test, and then how to write a proper thesis statement. So to kind of jump right into it, when you look at really the types of questions that you can get, there are really five major questions that you can get. Now, there are two essays on the APUS history exam. You have what's known as the long response essay and the DBQ. And so like these stems, like these different types of questions, they can end up on your DBQ and they could also end up on your long response. For the beginning, we're going to not really focus on the DBQ until a little bit later in class, so we're going to be focusing mostly on the long response essay. So when you look at these questions here, I tried to go from easiest kind of question to more difficult kind of question. So I think the easiest kind of question that you're going to see is a compare and contrast question. So they might ask you to compare different regions of, let's say, the colonial America and how they developed, to compare different eras presidency, let's say, for example, like foreign and domestic policies of different presidents. So it's a simple kind of compare and contrast question. And that's probably the easiest kind of question that you'll get on an AP exam. The next one, which we're going to kind of use as our sample question a little bit later, is going to be evaluate the causes and consequences. So you have to get familiar a little bit with the language that they like to use on the test. Causes, I think, is straightforward. Consequences. Really, consequences, all they mean by that is effect. So it's a cause and effect kind of question. But what I want you to notice, all of these questions are asking you to evaluate. Even these compare and contrast questions, they're not simply asking you to describe similarities and differences. They're going to ask you to evaluate these similarities and differences that you're able to come up with. And that's an important thing to understand. Evaluating is kind of analyzing the history, giving reasons behind why things happen, synthesizing it, being able to pick it apart and decipher it. It's not just about telling what happened, it's about evaluating it, analyzing it, seeing trends in the history, and being able to make valid conclusions based off of what you know. So again, evaluate causes and consequences. That means why did it happen, and then effects of it happening. All right. The next big question that you'll see is turning point questions. So for example, from something we've already studied in class, they might ask you to evaluate Christopher Columbus's journey in 1492 as a turning point in American history. Now that's a much better question for world history than it would be for American history, but we're kind of limited in what we've studied so far. So to kind of give you guys an example, but there's many turning points in American history that we're going to study, and oftentimes they'll ask you not just to kind of just talk about it being a turning point. They'll ask you to evaluate whether you believe it is a turning point or it's not a turning point, because a lot of things are debatable. You know, I could say the drafting of the Articles of Confederation was a turning point in American history, and you might disagree with it, and so you'll have to kind of defend your position while you write your essay. All right, number 4, the next one is they'll give you a quote about something, and they'll ask you to agree with it, disagree with it, or modify the quote. So I think you guys have seen this before. I mean, we did this on a daily quiz, I think twice we did this on a daily quiz where I gave you a quote, and I asked you to defend or refute the quote. So they'll use the language agree or disagree. The thing that you've probably never seen before is they ask you, if you want, you have a choice of modifying the quote. So it's kind of like in between. You're not quite agreeing with it. You're not quite disagreeing with it. You're tweaking the quote a little bit. The last one, number 5, all the way at the bottom, down here, continuity and change. This is, I think, the most difficult question that you get. And what this means is they'll give you, let's say, an event in history. So let's say, for example, a little bit later we'll study a war called the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. So they might ask you a question like, analyze the French and Indian War as a source of continuity and change in American history. So really what they're asking you here is, again, kind of like a before and after. They want you to look at America before the French and Indian War, and then look at America after the French and Indian War. If you notice trends, things that have stayed the same throughout the time period, that's a continuity. If you notice things have changed afterwards, that's a change. Okay, so this is an evaluation. They're making you look at an event, look at what happened before, what was going on in America before, what was life like before, politically, socially, economically, what was it like after in these different categories. And they're asking you to kind of like compare them and see like what stayed the same, what's a continuity over time, and what's changed over time. So that's a little bit more challenging question, and we'll kind of get to that, not in our first essay. We'll kind of jump into that, I think, maybe in our second or our third essay to kind of like give you guys a little bit of time to warm up to it. So something that you want to be familiar with is something called the essay prompt. Okay, so the actual questions that we're going to get, we're going to refer to them as the prompt. So I want to work through a sample prompt with you, and I'm going to take you through writing a good thesis statement for the prompt, and to kind of get you guys feet wet with writing in our class. So the sample prompt we're going to use is evaluate the causes and consequences of the abolishment of the encomienda system in the Spanish colonies. So something that we did just on Friday in class. So a causes and consequences question about the encomienda system and getting rid of it. Why did they get rid of it? What are the major effects of getting rid of the encomienda system? So when you're trying to construct a thesis statement that addresses this question, or any question on an AP exam, there are certain things you want to keep in mind. So before we jump into the points that I put down here on the slide, first, things that are important. For our class, there's two things to keep in mind. First, your thesis statement is going to be one sentence long. You want to try and, it's one concise sentence that answers the question directly. Two, the location of your thesis statement is going to be the last sentence in your introduction paragraph. All right, so to repeat that, we're going to try and make our thesis one sentence long, a concise statement that answers directly the question, and two, it's going to go at the end of your introduction paragraph. Now, very important things to keep in mind about the makeup of your thesis statement. So the first thing is right here. You have to take a strong argumentative position. So what you want to keep in mind is that these thesis statements, what we're doing in our class is argumentative collegiate writing. It's taking a position on something in history. Okay, so you're not simply retelling history. You're not making just kind of a description of what happened. It's analysis. That's the important thing. Analyzing the history and kind of deciphering the history. You want to take a strong position. Remember, keep in your mind when you're writing a thesis statement, is it argumentative? Is it something that can be proven through facts, through detail, or is it just something that like tells a fact already? It has to take a point of view, a position on the history. The second thing that's important, you're going to have to go beyond just restating the question. So I'll give you samples a little bit later about thesis and show you a thesis statement that just restates the question, but that's not going to get you very much credit at all. It's not really a thesis statement if you just restate what the question has asked you. So you're going to have to come up with your own original form of a thesis statement. So you don't want to just pattern it after the way the question is being asked. The last thing, which I think is very important, is in a thesis statement, you want to include what. So the what is your position, like what is your position on the question, so your stance. But the other thing that often students leave out is the why or how component of a thesis statement. So you want to show why you have this position in your thesis statement, or how your position is like substantiated through your thesis statement. So it can be a lot to kind of put into one sentence. So I just want to kind of we'll go back and look at the prompt. So it says, evaluate the causes and consequences of the abolishment of the encomienda system in the Spanish colonies. So keep the prompt in mind, and we're going to look at a sample of what I think is an excellent thesis statement. Okay, and we're going to decipher why it's an excellent thesis statement. And then after that, we'll look at some ones that are not as good, And what hopefully you guys can see the difference between the thesis statements, what makes a really good thesis statement and what makes a weaker one. So this, I think, is what I would call an analytical, solid thesis statement. Directly answers the question and really gives some nice insight into why they believe that they're in this position. So let's read it together. The Christian values of the vocal Franciscan missionaries and the rapid decimation of the Indian population due to disease led to the abolishment of the encomienda system. But the economic demands of a cash crop economy facilitated the growth of the Atlantic slave trade as a replacement labor system. So let's talk about what makes this good. First and foremost, it answers the question directly. It's telling you the causes for why the encomienda system was abolished. It's giving you the major effects in their eyes of what happened as a result of the abolishment of the encomienda system. But what really makes it good is it kind of gives you some depth, some detail as to why, okay? So it's giving you specific things that they can prove throughout their essay. So first, talking about the Christian values. So this person is going to go into Bartolomeo de las Casas and his attempt to defend the Indians and kind of argue against the encomienda system. It also brings up social aspects. It's going to talk about the effects of the Columbian exchange and diseases that are spread. So it's giving you some depth and some detail. And then also in the effects, it's giving you some depth and detail about the fact that they have cash crops, that they still need a labor source. And so even though they had these Christian values, or certain people in the Spanish world had these Christian values, the economic values kind of superseded that. And it was still necessary to have some kind of labor system. All right? So that's a solid thesis statement, a very, very good thesis statement. So what we're going to look at next are common mistakes I've seen students make in the past when they write thesis statements, so that we're going to try and avoid writing thesis statements like the ones that follow. So often I'll see students, and I call this like a vague thesis statement. It remains analytical, but it's vague. So let's read it together. The religious values of the Spanish and the effects of disease led to the abolishment of the encomienda system, but it was replaced by slavery to continue improving the economy. So let's look at this thesis statement in comparison to the first thesis statement. They both basically say the same thing. They're both basically saying that religion plays a role in why they got rid of it. The fact that disease is kind of leading to the decline, and that slavery replaced it. But then the need for kind of like the economy replaced it. But this remains vague, right? The religious values. Well, what do you mean, the religious values? What religion are they? Who's pushing these religious values? The Spanish. Who within the Spanish? Is it all of the Spanish? Is it the people who own the plantations? Is it the government? It's not being specific enough, okay? And then over here was replaced by slavery to continue improving the economy. Okay, again, vague. It doesn't tell you what kind of economy they have, why there was such a demand for a labor source that they needed to use slavery to replace it. So it's analytical. It does kind of give some different points here, but it's not concrete enough. It doesn't give you as much depth as necessary. All right, the next one that I think is also a common mistake that you see is a weak but descriptive thesis. Okay, so this one is not analytical at all. It just kind of describes what happened. So the encomienda system was abolished in the mid-1500s and was replaced by an African slave-based system. It takes no point. It deciphers nothing. It doesn't break anything down. It's just purely describing the history. Okay, so again, a kind of thesis statement we don't want to be writing. The last one, which I see sometimes, are people simply restating what the question has asked. So like in this case, there were several key economic causes and many social and economic consequences of the abolishment of the encomienda system. Again, this says nothing. The fact that you threw in the word economic and social and economic consequences doesn't make it a thesis statement. You have to show command of the history. So I'm going to leave you guys with the good quality thesis statement that you want to try and model your writing after. It has depth and it has insight into the history. Okay, I'll see you guys on